The latest news of the Singwan Society broadcast that the virus T was infected. The Ministry of Defense officially announced this. It was also reported that the city fed finally, a huge number of monsters wandered on the streets. The news said that the level of danger significantly exceeded the maximum indicators. The news was constantly broadcast on television. The journalists were very scared. In the news, he reported that a week ago, the Minister of Defense, a virus, and 13 advanced detachments were sent to the city. Journalists reported that the whole team was killed. None of the people survived. The young man heard how in the news they said that it was necessary to honor the memory of the heroes and thought that 7 people from the team were alive. A group of 7 people moved one after another. They needed to get to the roof of the building. On the back of the guy there was a sister, Zian, who held onto her brother very tightly. When the man found her, he found out that she was the only person who was not struck by the virus. If it is possible to extract antibodies from her body, then it will be possible to use them to combat the virus. The man thought that they could create a vaccine that could save humanity. The guy still wanted to think about something, but what he saw in front shocked him. The pupils of his eyes narrowed with fright. There, at the end of the corridor, he saw the silhouettes of people who, faster and faster, began to approach them. These were monsters who longed for blood. There were a lot of them, and they fled forward. The team did not expect to see so many monsters in this building. The guys took out their weapons and swore. The commander told Xiao Qi to take the doctor to the roof of the building and ordered the rest of the fighters to stay with him. The doctor said that there was no need to make sudden decisions and noted that he could not allow the team to sacrifice himself for him. Xiao Qi took the young man for his clothes and said that they did not have time. The girl dragged the doctors behind him, and he turned around. She said that Mr. E was the hope of all mankind. She pushed the man onto the roof and told him that he should survive for the sake of all humanity. The young man, along with his sister, who was behind him, fell from a strong push. The guy got up, went to the door that led from the roof to the building, and asked the girl why she closed the door and offered to escape together. Xiaoqi said that they have little time, so the Lord should listen to her carefully. The girl said that there is a descent on the roof. They can be used to move to the neighboring building and avoid a collision with a zombie. She said that then E should go to the Blia Bridge. There will be the military. When they get there, they will be safe. The girl stared at the man and asked him to remain the same strong for the sake of Chen. Mr. E looked through the glass at the door to Xiao, and she told him that they would survive no matter what. The young man and his sister were left alone on the roof. They had no other way out of the situation on how to move to a neighboring building. What the guy did? He put on insurance, and the sister kept holding on to his brother very much. The crossing was not very simple, because below there was a huge number of monsters who curved and pulled their hands up. The girl kept holding on to her brother. She began to cry and ask her brother, would they really leave? Qianxian stared intently in the eyes and with tears in her eyes began to ask whether they would return for those people who stayed there. The man scored at the girl and replied that they could not return, and she should remember that those people sacrificed themselves to protect them. The brother explained that if they survive, they would save more people. Then the victim of the group will be justified. He said that the girl wiped her tears and would not look back. After some time, they found themselves near the roof of a neighboring building. There were terrible monsters. Brother and sister were on the roof, and the brother put the Qianxian near the fence. And he thought he was doing... The guy found a piece of reinforcement and began to beat the monsters with all his might. They were very angry. Mr. E was very angry. He beat monsters and told them that no one would stop him. The man was so angry that he very quickly dealt with the opponents, and they no longer posed a danger to him and his sister. The guy crouched near the curb to take his breath. The girl approached him and asked if he was all right. E stroked his sister on the head, asked her not to worry, and said that he had dealt with a bunch of weak zombies. He hugged the girl and said that they would get to the first floor on the bodice and go straight to the Blia Bridge. The brother told his sister that when they reach the bridge, then they will be completely safe. The girl listened carefully to her brother, lowered her head and called a guy by name. Then she clenched her hands into her fists and asked her brother to use her blood to save people. In the eyes of a man, a very strong fright was read. He looked at his sister with understanding and love, and the girl with tears in her eyes said that while you can save a lot of people, she is not afraid of death. The man crouched near Qianxian and told her that she would not die, and very soon they would be safe. They went to the bridge, and E thought that the sister thought that she should sacrifice herself for the sake of saving others. The guy became very serious and mentally promised his sister that he would do everything to protect her. There was an early rainy morning. A military helicopter flew in the sky. He patrolled the bridge on which there were remains of cars. On the checkpoint, there were two armed military, who reported that they had successfully eliminated the crowd of zombies. One of the men told the elder that he had heard that the city of F would bombard and asked what would be with the survivors. He replied that there were no more left there. The military looked at the site and told another that some people were on the bridge. The guy noted that something is most likely another zombie, which must also be eliminated. And the brother greatly pressed his sister to him, and they walked along the bridge on which the monsters lay, which no longer posed any danger. Hyunseon strongly squeezed her brother's clothes. What the little girl saw, she was very surprised. The baby saw the dots from the laser, the military who noticed people aimed at their feet. At the very last moment, the man was able to dodge the bullet, and she hit the road surface. The guy lowered his head and realized that now he was aiming in the body. He thought that the military understood something wrong. The man took out a test tube from his pocket, lifted it up and loudly said that he was an academician of the Hwagan Scientific and Technical Institute of Bioengineering and brought a sample of the virus. A helicopter flew over them, and Enon said that he was sure that he could create a vaccine with this virus, and then added that they were not infected. The military told the elder that they saw the survivors and asked what to do in such a situation. The second military said that the Tyrus T begins to manifest itself after 3 hours, and they do not have so much time, and the girl does not have a protective equipment, so it is better to kill people. Nan held a flask in his hands, looked up and thought about what was happening because the military had exactly heard what he said. The guy began to pull her sister's clothes. She was very scared and told her brother that she was scared. The guy crouched near the girl, hugged her strongly and said that she was not afraid of anything and promised that he would protect her. A helicopter flew over his brother and sister, and the military man ordered the people to stop on the bridge. Then there was a message that the military received information that Dr. Enon entered the city of F a week ago and was already officially recognized as dead. The person who said noted that they cannot establish his personality and determine whether The military also said that according to the new rules, anyone who stepped onto the bridge will be shot on the spot. Nan hugged his sister tightly and began to scream so that people waited, because he is really a doctor, and he is also sure that he could create a vaccine. But no one listened to the young man. The military was in a hurry to comply with the order, which was given from above. One of the bullets hit the baby in her chest. Pain, fear, and bewilderment were red in her eyes. The girl only called her brother more strongly. And Nan looked at his sister with pain. He was confused, because he did not understand what was happening. He began to take off the mask, as he realized that he no longer needed her, and the military shot a man monotonously. The man did not fully understand what was happening, because the military had to help him, and they said that if the guy is really Nan, then they can only thank him for his contribution. The rain went with all their might, and the brother and sister lay on the bridge, who pulled their hands to each other. The young man looked at his sister and wanted to tell her something, but these were only scraps of words. Hyunseon held out her hand to her brother and also wanted to say something to him, but she did not succeed. From the lips of a little girl, only scraps of words pulled out, and huge drops of tears rolled from her eyes. Just a few seconds later, she closed her eyes and only could ask her brother forgiveness. The bridge constantly monitored the drone, which constantly flew from the side. There was a video camera on it, which recorded everything that was happening. Users could watch it. People watched Dr. in real time in the chat, wrote that he could not be released. The runs of the Fate believed that it was most likely not him. But if Nan, then his release would lead to disasters. The parliament was collected, they gathered in order to discuss Dr. Nanya, as it was an important issue. One of the men said that the antibodies that the doctor spoke of really exist and they are not infected. The second man said that the bomber would go in a week. Then the zombies and the virus will finally disappear and offered to shoot Inanya. The third man shouted that everything was true and also offered to shoot the professor as soon as possible. And the fourth supported the execution because he believed that they did not need any antibodies. All members of the parliament were unanimous and voted for the execution of Dr. Nanya. So it was decided that the doctor needs to be eliminated, and a correspondence was conducted in the chat that a good job was done. One of the members of the parliament thought that if was killed, he mentally thanks him for his contribution to humanity. And the rain poured more and stronger. 2 military people came to the bridge who passed the doctors and his sisters and began to install explosives. They reported to the main thing that the explosives were installed, and they were ordered to quickly evacuate and blow it up within 10 minutes. The military with lightning speed executed the order of the main one, and literally a few minutes later the bridge was blown up. The performers reported to the elder that all sections of the bridge were blown up, thereby the spread of the virus from the city of Effie. The remains of the bridge and the body of the zombie fell into the river, and the elder ordered the rest of the staff from the city of Effie. Only supports were reminiscent of the bridge, and pieces of concrete, which no longer drowned in the river, and the crows circled over all this chaos. Among the pile of rubbish lay a guy over whom a flock of crows, impudent birds, circled. One of the raven was so insolent that she wanted to shout to the guy's eyes. But the man was alive. He grabbed the impudent bird by the throat with his last strength. He did not like such a rebuff. The young man held the crow tightly. He did not fully understand what was happening to him. Just a few minutes later, the guy opened his eyes very widely, and his pupils narrowed very much. The man clasped his teeth. He did not have the strength to hold the bird in his hands, and he unclenched his hand. The guy squeezed his lips to such an extent that they turned white and grabbed his hand by the throat. He became very bad. The man began to cough, and then he was sick. The guy was so bad that droplets of sweat appeared on his face. He lowered his head down and rested his hands on the ground. Gradually, the young man began to turn gray. After a while, the guy felt relief and thought that he was still alive, but his heart does not beat. But he lives. Perhaps all this because of his blood. He looked around and thought that she and her sister had one blood, which is why she should be alive. A few minutes later, the young man saw his sister's body, which lay not far from him. The guy began to look at to make sure that it was she. His doubts disappeared. Enan got up and began to run to his younger sister. He called her by name, but she did not respond. The man took the girl in his arms, called by name, shook, but she did not react. He opened his eye to his sister to look at the girl's pupils, because after physical death, white spots appear on the cornea. The pupils of Tianxian were still clean, and the body had no signs of damage. The guy put the girl on the ground and thought that how it is possible that there are no signs of life. The military in binoculars carefully watched E. He thought about what the zombie was doing. Was it really disappointed that he could no longer bite anyone? Then the military said that he was very sorry that he was not on mortar now. Otherwise, he would have a taste of a shell to taste. The military opened the car window and shouted very loudly to hear. He said goodbye to the city. The young man lowered his head and thought that it was all over, and then said that he hears the military. The guy saw an interesting object and began to get to him. He thought about how it ended so. The man took out the case for the violin and placed his sister there. He thought about how the city became the environment for the habitat of the virus. He began to close the case from the violin and mentally promised his sister that he would find a way to wake her. The guy found some clothes, put it on, and thought that they would not return home. He walked to the houses from which smoke came and thought that for them and his sister in this world there was no place. News sounded in the dark room. The journalist said that there were no survivors in the city of F, and the blockade of the city was confirmed. The woman held the telephone in her hands and large tears dripped right on him. And in the news they said that explosive work was being carried out in the city. The old woman thought about how to save her daughter. She sent a message that she was alive and really wanted to eat and drink. In the sky, the moon was shining, and people in other cities lived a calm, measured life. On the banks of the river, young people set up a tent. They carelessly rested and spent time. One of the guys said that he was very glad, as he could capture the moment of the explosion of the Blaya Bridge, and the second said that the city of F would be blocked, and then it would be exploded. The guy with a smile on his face noted that this should solve the problem of the virus T, so what else you can worry about? The second guy read on the phone that the virus cannot be transmitted through water. The public claims this. The guy entered the water with a clock and said that all this is fine, but he was still bothering him. And then he said that he is a biologist and other article Inanya, that viruses can interact with prokaryotes and act as an organella for evolution. He noticed that the guy recently found out about this, and experts also thought about it, then asked if it was possible to catch shrimp. The guy said that this was possible. Young people began to shine with a flashlight and say that they need to follow the surface of the water and catch the shrimp with a net. But not shrimp sailed. Enan got into the city of F and thought that he did not know what more dangers are in the city. The young man came to the conclusion that if he returns to that laboratory, he will be able to find a way to save Tianxian. He looked at the axe with which someone perforated the tires and thought that a bunch of useful weapons should be gained. Enan went to the car and began to get an axe. The guy was sure that he would definitely come in handy. In the hands of the guy, in addition to the axe, there was still a canister. He thought that he needed to check for some moment. He swung and threw the axe into the glass window of the store. Because there he had previously seen monsters, the axe struck the glass and flew into the head of one of the monsters. Others stood in bewilderment, and others were born. After some time, the monsters began to run out of the store and headed towards E, who held a lighter in one hand, and in the second canister, one group of monsters went around the car behind, and the other in front. But for them it was as if invisible. They did not pay any attention to him. The young man looked at everything that was happening with surprise. He could not understand what was happening. He looked at the monsters and thought that they were accepting him as a similar one. The guy entered one place where he was able to get cartridges, a semi-automatic gun. He thought that he and Xianxian would definitely survive. A man in an oxygen mask and an axe in his hands was very surprised. Someone in the company of people, everyone was in oxygen masks and weapons, said that there was much more zombies than it was yesterday. One of the members of the group asked him to be covered. He fought with monsters. The young man was very reckless and did not pay attention to the fact that a monster began to bite his hand. The guy killed him and immediately told boss about this. He ordered to keep him a distance. Another person approached the speaking and informed the boss that things were very bad. Zombies attacked people. They wanted to surround them. The boss with his foot pushed into the crowd of an infected employee and ordered him to feed them. A group of people began to leave the scene, and zombies attacked an infected man. After some time, near one of the buildings, they saw E, who stood calmly and did not even try to attack them. The guy held a weapon in his hands. The finger was on the trigger. He carefully watched everything that was happening. People in oxygen masks looked at the guy with surprise, but one held a metal pipe in his hands. Men began to ask each other a man in front of him, since E really looked very strange. The guy walked along the dark and destroyed streets of a once beautiful and flowering city. He held the weapon. The finger was always in the area of the trigger. The guy was alert. After some time, an arrow flew right near his head. He barely managed to dodge. He stopped, squeezed the weapon that he held in his hands even more tightly. The guy saw people in oxygen masks that turned to him. The boss extended the axe forward and began to ask for why he was not biting the zombies and whether he released them. The man got angry as he lost his brother. The guy looked at the guys and thought that they had standardized oxygen masks and thought about whether there were other such groups in the city. He looked at the guys and was silent, and they began to talk to each other that the young man, perhaps deaf. He removed the mask from one of the men, directed the weapon at him, and began to ask where they took the masks. The members of the group who stood a little at a distance began to speak among themselves that the stranger was very fast and was able to dodge. The man, in the direction of which the weapon was directed, said that the main group was in the city center, and they exchanged masks for supplies. He carefully listened to the speaker and thought that they may have what he needed. The guy who was sitting on the ground said that some misunderstanding arose between them, so he wanted to distract him. One of the members of the group began to roll up from the back to Inanya, to the case in which his sister was. This act very much angered the young man, and he shot the whole team from the gun. One of the men realized that it was necessary to dump from this place as quickly as possible to escape. But the monsters saw him and began to run after the man. He ran away from all his feet, because he understood that he needed to be saved. The zombies did not stop. They clashed their teeth, held out their hands forward. Inan calmly went ahead, because he was not in danger. He was absolutely calm. After some time, the man was near a huge building. He raised his head up. The guy thought that he was here again, and the memories did not give him rest. Inan calmly entered the building. On the floor were the remains of either zombies or people. But the young man went forward to the elevator. No matter what, they continued to work. The guy entered the elevator and thought that the laboratory should be on the 16th floor. He became interested in whether the zombies managed to destroy all the equipment. The elevator doors began to open, and the man saw a terrifying picture. There was a huge amount of zombies on the floor, and one of them tormented the body of his captain. From what he saw, the guy passed frost on the skin, but he hoped so that the team members were alive. He took an axe that was lying nearby and began to beat the zombies and shout that they took his hands from him. The man was very angry. He struck the axe with an axe for everyone who pulled his hands to him. When it ended, he sat down near the captain and thought that it was possible to assume that he took revenge on him. The guy put his hand to the captain's chest and thought that he was resting with the world. The young man felt for a piece of paper and began to pull it out, because he was curious what was written there. Inan opened a huge map and looked at her with surprise. The guy realized that he was in front of him of the Tower of Gemini. On the plan, there were some marks that made by hand red paste. On one room, there was an inscription that it needed to be destroyed. He looked at the map and thought that he was seeing her for the first time. He thought about the captain, most likely, had his own secret mission. The guy folded the card and put it in his pocket. He thought that all this could somehow be connected with the virus T. He thought that in that room there could be a hint to the resurrection of his sister. He leaned over the captain and thought that the captain would most likely decide to abandon his mission to escort him with his sister. The guy was traveling in the elevator and thought that the mission to withdraw him from the city of F was only a cover. The elevator stopped on the 55th floor, and E realized that the main mission was the destruction of that room. The guy left the elevator and a very unpleasant smell immediately hit him in his nose. He looked at the floor and saw rat decompositions there. He closed his nose and mouth with his hand. Since the smell was very strong, tears appeared on the young man's face. The guy had a huge number of rat corpses under his feet. He could not understand why there were so many. He sat down near one of the rat corpses and drew attention to the fact that they have arched wounds on their heads and there is no brain. The man thought about who conducted an animal of such an operation. He was very surprised. After some time, E got up and said that all this is not important. He needs to find a room that was marked on the map. And the young man went right along the dark corridor to the room that was marked on the map. Just a few seconds later, he heard some sounds, so he took a weapon. The guy twisted the shutter, put his finger on the trigger and began to watch what was happening from around the corner. At the end of the corridor, the guy saw a man who was in a white coat. He was dead and held a scalpel in his hands. He came closer to him and said that this man could make such bullying over mice. And then the young man examined him and noticed that this zombie differed from the rest. He drew attention to the fact that the holes from the bullets were present on the zombie body and came to the conclusion that there were armed people. From the thoughts of the professor, some kind of noise distracted, and he became the side with which sounds emanated. The guy looked at one of the doors and thought that someone was behind her. The young man took the scalpel in his hands and quietly went to the door, because of which the noise was heard. He put his hand to her and thought that he felt 3 sources of heartbeat. With a run, he entered the room. There were 2 armed men in military uniform and a bound girl who kneel. In his direction, one of the men immediately turned around and sent a weapon at him. A little more, and he would have shot. Nan perfectly understood that he should not hesitate, because the surprise is his main trump card, so he immediately dealt with the first man. He went to the second guy who directed the gun to the girl and took out his weapon. The man was very angry, since he did not let them complete the task that he was delegated. The military thought that the guy wanted to cut him, but he was mistaken. Nan did not think for a long time. He immediately shot in the hand in which the gun was, and then in the head. The young man twisted the shutter and looked intently at the girl, who was very surprised. The guy thought that the men with whom he dealt with practically did not pay attention to him. After all, they were only interested in the murder of a woman. Nan began to untie the girl. He thought that something was probably wrong with her. She also broke off her wags and breathed very hard. A drop of sweat appeared on the girl's face. When the girl was freed, the guy looked around and saw an interesting door. He was very surprised, since there was a lot of explosives near her. The young man approached her with the words that, "Behind this door is exactly what the authorities wanted to destroy so much." The guy was very interested in what to stay behind the door, and he began to open it. When the door opened, the professor saw the flask near which the parrot was sitting. They were connected by a green glow. The guy was very interested in what was in the flask, and he began to look at her carefully. Nan was shocked by what he saw. He perfectly realized that the brains of those very mice were in the flask. The man continued to look at the flask. She attracted him with a magnet. But his parrot was distracted. The bird stared at the guy and over again called him by name. It was very surprising for Inanya. The young man looked at the parrot and was surprised to think that the bird knew his name. And the parrot began to talk about that the guy sees his fake. It was difficult to speak to the bird. The parrot said that he controlled the birds through the sewer. Then came here. Then the bird said about the brain of rats, which are connected to transmit information. The man stared at the speaking bird and said that he was in front of him, a biological communication device that was collected at a distance. He approached the device that informed him that the answer would wait at the laboratory of the University of Qingyang. The guy looked at the device and thought about something. He was interested in why the laboratory was here. The young man went to the door. As he heard some strange sounds behind her, the guy stepped aside and began to think about something, because what he saw in this room shocked him. As here, the door swung open and the girl, whom he saved a few minutes ago, directed the weapon at him. She ordered the guy to raise his hands up. Nan noticed that she was definitely better. A hand with a gun started down. The girl opened her mouth wide in surprise. A fright was red in her eyes because she only now began to guess that she was in front of her Professor E. She blushed with shame and joyfully said that he was very glad of the fact that he was alive. E began to search the guys who killed, and the girl told him that her name is Chen and Wei, and she is a senior researcher at the Institute N. The woman held the gun in her hand and directed it to E, and the guy told her that the weapon of the M2000 model, he was created in the country M. He was very accurate but not charged. E Nan asked the girl would not seem to her impolite to send a pistol to a man all this time. The girl threw the gun aside and said that she did not think that such a sophisticated person would be new in such things. He went to the second man, began to examine him and said that by their uniforms, one can come to the conclusion that they were mercenaries. The young man came to the conclusion that the only conglomerate that has a connection with them is a group of 4 stars. The girl carefully listened to Ananya, went up to him, began to inspect the clothes of men and said that there was something in the layer of their clothes. After some time, she found a cardboard rectangle and said that he looked like a certificate from the institute. E took the certificate in her hands, and the girl showed her finger. On is the emblem of the underground research center of the laboratory of the University of Xinjiang. The young man opened his eyes wide in surprise and thought that this was the very place. He turned his head to the girl and asked her why the mercenaries wanted to kidnap her. The woman said that she demanded a password for the research center of the underground biological laboratory of the University of Xinjiang. The guy began to collect his things and asked the girl whether someone, besides her, knew this password. The girl thought for a few seconds, and then replied that the password was known only to her. The woman said that the password is changing with some frequency. Before the flash of the virus on was the last person who entered the laboratory. She said that she returned to the city of F, as it seemed to her that someone wanted to substitute her, and then told Professor E that she wanted to investigate this matter. The young man did not answer, only began to check the uniform, and the girl asked him to let her go with him. He thought that the Underground Research Center was the main laboratory of the country N. He was interested in what an answer was waiting for him there. The guy replied that he could not allow her to follow herself, but personally go there to find out what happened there. The girl carefully listened to the professor, came to him very close and whispered something in her ear. And then she said that Professor E now also knows the password. Then the woman asked maybe he could still take her with him. But he gave the girl a box in his hands and said that she would take her, since there were supplies and weapons in her, and then added that after 6 days the country N would begin the bombardment of the city of F. The guy told the girl that she could stay here and added that she had enough bread for 6 days. Professor E began to go, and the woman began to ask what about him. But the man continued silent. Inan went to the elevator, and the girl looked at him and waited for at least some answer to her question. The young man turned, looked into the woman's eyes and answered, "If after 6 days she was alive, then this means that he did everything." The girl was left on the floor completely alone, and she told the professor after that he did not even know that she had been following him all these years. There were cars in the parking lot, there were zombies near them, some walked, and the latter did nothing. Nan went to one car and said that he had the feeling that someone specifically damaged all the cars that are in this area. The guy looked at the monsters and thought that the laboratory was 20 kilometers from this place. It would be difficult without a car, and thought to look for a car in another place. In one of the lanes was a man. With one hand he held a large bag, and the second knocked strongly on a closed door. After some time, the boy with tattoos opened the door to him. He had a cigarette in his mouth. He looked at the man in surprise. Stuttering, he said that he had come for food. A man was played in front of the elder, as he depended on him. Then he added that he also came for a gas mask. The man felt awkwardly. Droplets of sweat appeared on his face from experiences. A man with tattoos said that the ragged man stops chatting and better show the goods, and he began to untie the bag. There was a girl in the bag. Her mouth was sealed with tape, and her hands were tied with a rope. Tears flowed from her eyes. A man with tattoos began to carefully examine the girl. A smile appeared on his face, and he noted that such a product was suitable. Another man came out of the room, and the three of them raised the bag in which the girl was located. A man with tattoos threw under his feet a man who brought a bag with a girl, an oxygen mask, and some food. He began to beat at the door and began to shout that he had fulfilled everything exactly, that he told him to lure the girl and asked for something else. At this time, a man with tattoos opened a bag. He took out a girl and pushed her with all his might. The girl fell to the floor, hit very hard. Tears in her eyes appeared from resentment and pain. She looked around and saw that women with children were still in the room. The young woman tried to get up from the floor, then turned around to look at the man who stood in the doorway. There was a small van on the corner of one of the streets of the city. It was not like other cars in this area. The man told the driver that they had little fuel. They could not even leave the area, and then asked where to look for supplies. The driver did not answer the question, but said that the passenger looked aside because someone was approaching them. One of the men noted that the guy had a small box with him, and then concluded that he was most likely somewhat crazy. The driver touched the man by the shoulder and said that this is a man, not a zombie, and he was looking for something. The passenger noted that the older brother said that they need to deal with anyone who dares to go outside in search of food, and said that the driver ran into the guy. He did not think for a long time and immediately hit the gases, but Anan was alert and realized that something extraordinary. The man took out the weapon, reloaded it, and began to watch the van. The passenger told the driver that things are bad since the guy is armed. Anan did not wait until the car ran into it and immediately began to shoot on the car. The guy did not shoot at the tires, as he planned to use transport. The van drove past the young man and stopped at the end of the street. The driver lost control. The men who were in the car lost consciousness from the blow, and the driver wheezed in pain. Anan pulled one of the guys from the van and began to shake with all his might. But the guy did not open his eyes. The professor stood on the van, holding men by the scrushing. He screamed heart-rending because there were zombies near the car. He asked the man why they wanted to run into him, and he himself thought that they were also wearing masks, just like those bandits. The guy had droplets of sweat on his face, and he replied that the leader ordered anyone who dares to leave his house. The man asked for that he would not let him go to the zombie, and those in turn pulled their hands to him. Nan thought that the guys deliberately destroyed all the cars in the area, so they took control of it and did not allow the survivors to leave it. He began to ask the guy where their base is, how many people there. He replied that in the central office building and there were 8 of them. Nan let the man go, and he got behind the wheel of a car. Zombies, which gathered in a heap, were left behind. The guy looked at the fuel level in the trunk and realized that he was very small, which means that he could not get to the laboratory. Nan told himself that he had guesses that they have a huge amount of fuel on the basis. After some time, the professor drove up to the base, near the doors of which there was a man. He stood and looked at the van and said that the guys quickly returned. Apparently, they did not really find anything. The car regularly stood for a few minutes, and then Nan directed it right on the man. He was very surprised and said that something was wrong here, because his team members could not do that. And Nan did not think for a long time. He deliberately wrote a guy who tried his hands to stop the vehicle. Zombies came out of the car, who headed for a man who fell from a blow. At this time, a man entered the room in which women and children were located and said to be shown new. He saw a woman who cried and shook with fear. The man immediately determined what she was. The scoundrel immediately grabbed her wrists and said that the girl should pay for her residence in this place. The woman screamed very much, cried, huge tears rolled from her eyes, and the man tore her clothes. Then the doors opened into the room, and the guy shouted that they had problems. The man looked at him inquiringly, and then he began to shout very much. He was very angry, since the kid hung him very much. The guy said that the car rammed their building. In the car, there was a group of monsters, which will break through a minute for a minute. The man began to leave the room and ordered the guy to tide women and children and threw their zombies, and he could leave through the rear exit. The young man very quickly completed the order. He tied women and children and told them to go to another exit. The little girl looked in the direction where the guy pointed and was very scared. A huge crowd of zombies headed for them. They grinned their teeth and held out their hands to people. Literally a few seconds later, the zombie was near one of the women. She yelled with horror. But the zombie did not manage to do anything, since the bullet stopped his existence. She fell straight into his head. The woman crouched, but other monsters also could not approach her. They were waiting for the same fate as the first. The kid went up to the woman and sternly told her that she would rise faster, and behind him it was clear how the monsters were coming. Then Nan told the girl to take the rest, and showed in which room it was necessary to hide. Women with children very quickly fulfilled the order of the man. They realized that he wanted only good to them. Zombies walked along the corridors of the building, including past the room where there were people, but they did not touch them. Young people who left people in the room loaded important things in a car, and the elders commanded them to hurry because the zombies are already close. But their plan turned out to be a failure. Along with the zombie, went out into the street, and the guys realized that they had to run. Nan got into the car. Women and children saved by him approached him. The little girl smiled. From hesitation, a blush appeared on her cheeks. She thanked the guy saved them. But he was not verbose. He remembered his sister and said only that he did not save anyone. Women with children remained standing in the same place, and Nan left at all speed. The The parliament gathered again. The chief said that they were going to destroy some buildings in the city of F so that no one would know about the source of the virus. A man with a red-haired beard said that the biological laboratory of Qingyang University is also subject to destruction. One of the men asked if those present seemed to be too in a hurry. The man in glasses stood up, spread his arms to the sides, and invited those present to arrange a vote. Members of the company of 4 stars raised their hands up, thereby they supported the destruction of buildings in the city of F. A huge number of those present supported the idea, but one man said that he was against. No one expected such an answer from him, which is why everyone fell silent. The room became very quiet. And then a nervous laughter was heard. The representative of modern conglomerates said that he was against it. He noticed that he should not make hasty decisions. The man was silent for a moment, and then added that he was sure that there are many survivors in the city of Effie. The representative of the company of 4 stars was surprised to ask a man to doubt whether he was in their statement. A man with a beard began to talk about the results of the investigation of a group of experts of their company, who came to the conclusion that there is not a single survivor in the city of F. The man stared at his comrade and noticed that he was not surprised by such data, since the experts were funded by 4 stars. Some man also raised his hand and said that he agreed with the words of modern conglomerates and noticed that he was also against. He was supported by someone else present. The mayor of the city of F noticed that the voices were distributed equally and offered to postpone the bombardment. He said that the drones of the company of 4 stars were sent to the city in order to confirm the lack of survivors. The representative of the company smiled maliciously after the words of the mayor of the city and agreed with his proposal. On one of the roofs of the city there were people. They were very tired, and drones began to circle over them. One of the men first saw them and joyfully screamed that everyone looked up at the drones, and then added that they were saved. He left his pregnant wife behind, and with the words that the saving operation finally arrived and the country did not abandon them, began to wave his hands and scream that they were here. The man screamed to help them, waved his hands greatly and with joy, called for help. But his joyful cries were very quickly interrupted, and the pregnant wife looked in surprise at how her pink dress was polluted. The drones that flew over the houses were not there at all for salvation. They were equipped with weapons. The woman, who realized that her husband began to fall to the floor, screamed frantically. Large tears appeared on her eyes. Her strong scream was very quickly stopped. The shock drone did not stand on ceremony with her. People who were on the roof of the building and watched all this were very shocked. One woman screamed very much. One of the girls quickly realized what was happening and began to run away from the roof. They screamed so that other people follow her example. Not only drones, but also shock helicopters bombed the city. Schools were the first to go under the distribution. The community of the city, because it was there that people were hidden. They hoped so that the city leadership would do everything in order to save them. But everything was different. Behind this, everyone watched a member of the company of 4 stars. The form with a drone and helicopters was broadcast directly to him on the screen of a huge TV. On the screen, he saw information that 2,857 people were cleaned in the city of F. The man noted that he did not think that there would be so many rats in the city. The guy who was also in the room quietly said that the survivors had a family outside the city, and the man said that they are now protesting. The young man stared at a man with a beard and asked him if they really act correctly. He got up and said that the guy would not screw himself, and then noticed that they were doing this in order to destroy the virus. He showed his hand to the screen and added that when the city of F is destroyed, they will become saviors. A man with a beard picked up a remote control. A photo of the building appeared on the screen, and he noticed that there was an underground complex and he is sure that people were hiding there. He added that he personally gave the order that this place was destroyed, and the assistant agreed with him. Then the man said that the president of the state N sent his people there and said that this time he better not to poke his nose into this matter. The assistant bowed to the guy and agreed with all his words. And then the man said that the laboratory of the University of Qingyang will be erased from the face of the earth that night. Nan arrived at the laboratory of the University of Qingyang and stood near the entrance that led to the dungeon. He looked at the steps that led down and thought that the underground research institute looked untouched. He went downstairs and thought that he did not know what secrets that this place was keeping, but he wants these people to join the city of F. After some time, a car came to the laboratory of the University of Qingyang at great speed. A girl came out of it, with whom Professor E had previously seen and began to be examined on the sides. She began to go to the building of the University of Qingyang. The street was calm, neither people nor zombies were nearby. The girl said that it was strange why every time she comes here, she is covered by an inexplicable sense of fear. She went into the building, passes past the tiles, which fell from the walls, and said that at first she needed to catch up with the Processor E. The girl walked along the corridor, saw the knocked-out underground passage, but stopped near him. She looked down. She felt ill. Her head was dizzy, and the girl thought about what was happening, because she was overwhelmed by such a very feeling of fear. She took her hand behind her head and began to think that something terrible had happened in this place. The girl felt very bad, took her hand by the mouth and said that she had a headache. She looked at the steps, and she herself asked whether she had rubbed her memory. And then she thought that she would not go down, but would hide somewhere on the stairs. There were no people at the research institute for a long time. It stood abandoned. A girl peeked around the corner. Her face was dirty, and in her hands she held a gun. After some time, she, along with other people, entered the laboratory. They tried to behave very quietly. A woman with a gun told everyone to behave quietly and move. One man was very nervous, was not very neat, and hooked a test tube with his elbow. She began to fall to the floor. All those present were horror, and only a woman with a gun caught her almost near the floor. The woman put the test tube in place and said that people be careful and not attract attention. They went along the corridor, and the woman said that the center of this place is the experimental base of environmental circulation, and added that they will have enough resources for a year. One of the men noticed that the entrance there was blocked, then asked the question whether they would be able to get alive. The woman answered him that the search and rescue team would return soon, and noted that everything would be fine with them. The man put his hand forward and began to show a side. He only stuttered with fear, and there was an unusual dog that gripped his teeth. Enan came out of some doors. He heard about how the system says that he was allowed access. The professor walked along the corridor, looked around, and the observation camera attracted his attention. He thought that someone was following him and came to the conclusion that this is the one who told him to come here. After some time, the guy stopped and began to consider the ragged wires. When he entered one of the premises, he saw a man sitting on the floor, and in front of him was a strange dog. The dog did not look typical. She gripped her teeth, and the saliva dripped from the mouth. Her eyes burned in red fire. The guy looked at the animal. He clasped his teeth with fear, and tears flowed from his eyes. He understood that his days were numbered. The silence was interrupted by the cry of the woman to whom the gun was. She was also very scared and understood that she needed to run away. But the dog, most likely, scared a strong scream. He grabbed a man who was sitting on the floor by the hand and tore it. The man screamed very much in pain. He looked at the wounded wound with surprise. But the dog was not going to leave the kid alone. From fear, droplets of sweat performed on his face, as with the help of a conventional knife, Professor Enan was very easy to cope with the dog. The young man stood above the body of the beast and examined him very carefully. The woman went to E and asked him if he was crazy, and then told him to run away if he did not want to die. The young man did not leave his seat. He carefully began to examine the strip on the woman's shoulder and realized that she was treating the laboratory. Enan looked directly into the woman's eyes and thought that she should know something. The man did not have time to ask anything, since other dogs began to run from the open door to them. They were simply not predictable and rushed at the professor, but he was absolutely calm. Enan did not have time to hide the knife yet, so he very easily dealt with the dogs. After that, the man wiped his droplets with his hand, which appeared above his upper lip. The people who stood nearby looked with enthusiasm after everything that was happening and thought about whether a person was really in front of them. Enan and other people entered the laboratory. The woman invited him to work together and added that she knew where the resources are located here. She said that he could spend him there. And the guy opened a notebook and began to study the information that was indicated there. The woman called the professor, but he thought that the laboratory has long been conducted experiments on the infection of T-virus. He remembered unusual dogs and came to the conclusion. The more time passed since the infection, the stronger the mutation, and those dogs were incredibly capable. He understood that the animals were infected earlier than the zombies outside, and the state knew about the results of the experiments, and there was no need to destroy the whole city. The man came to the conclusion that the city leadership does this because they are afraid of the virus. He realized that this fear is an excellent opportunity for revenge, and the woman at that time asked him whether she had heard what she said. The guy looked at her carefully. She smiled and said that she would help him. The woman also reported that he should listen to her, and otherwise they will all die. And they went somewhere forward along the corridor. Everyone thought about something of his own. The woman asked E whether he was sure that the government wants to destroy the city because there are a lot of survivors that need to be evacuated. And Nan recalled how under the bridge he heard the military's words that a week later from the city of Stone, on Stone would not remain and needed to bring down. The guy then said to himself that it was all over and agreed with this thought. Nan looked at women and told her that in the eyes of other people they were no longer people. The girl listened carefully to the professor and looked at him with surprise. They went to some door, the guy looked at her, and she opened. The girl was surprised to notice that the door could just open. She did not think that everything was so simple. Then the woman said that she had no access and how he managed to open the door so much. And she thought about whether this mysterious guy would really help her. He told the girl that they were watching them from the central zone and then added that someone was managing this place. The woman said that this was impossible since she activated the emergency switch before the incident. There was a vacuum. No one would survive. He calmly replied that she would not be so sure of this and then asked if she checked all the rooms. The woman wanted to answer something, but they stopped in front of the door and fell silent. Nan told everyone those present that he would enter the premises first, and they should not lag behind. The young man began to go into the room and he was told that he was careful. What he saw shocked him. People who stayed, on the other hand, only saw how their doors closed in front of their nose. Nan only heard about how they called him and realized that only he had access to this room. The man covered his eyes with his hands, as it was unusual for them to see a bright green color. Someone called a guy by name. After a while, the guy's eyes were used to the bright light, and he began to look at the room. His attention was attracted by a huge flask with green contained. There was a brain with his eyes in it. The guy heard a voice from a flask. She reported that they had finally met. The professor carefully looked at the green flask. He was very surprised and thought that this brain was talking. At this time, there were very strong explosions on the street. People fled to the laboratory building, because there it was possible to get into underground rooms. Men shouted to each other that they needed to run faster, but to move, because a safe place is very close. They were near the entrance to the dungeon, and one of the group noticed that the stone that blocked the entrance was displaced, and noted that someone was penetrated there. Men began to go down the steps. The main one ordered them to be careful, because they could wait for them below. Young people heard some kind of rustle, and a few seconds later an armed girl jumped out to them. The man in the group began to carefully examine the girl. He did not press the trigger. The man realized that the form in which the stranger is dressed belongs to the employees of their institute. He hid the weapon, raised his hands up and said that they were a search and rescue team. The girl lowered the gun down, but did not begin to hide it. She was frightened and wary. The man came closer to her and said that the woman would pass with them, because soon there will be a drone, and you need to go deep into it. The team went into the room where the killed dogs lay. One of the men began to ask where the infected dogs had gone and said that everyone was on the check. The girl was surprised to ask what dogs a man was talking about and added that she came here for Professor E, and then clarified what was wrong here. The man replied that the dogs were infected with virus T. They had gone crazy and killed about 30 members of their team in one night. The man turned his head, looked at the girl intently, and noticed that if the professor was here, he was most likely already dead. The girl shouted that this was impossible and said that before that the professor easily coped with 2 armed guys. And then she added that he could not cope with him so easily. The man replied that the girl was joking, since the professor is a scientist, but they are not capable of this. At this time, Nan was in the central part of the institute and looked at the test tube in which the brain was located. He told the professor that he saw that he and his sister had happened to the bridge. He looked with surprise, and the brain said that he saw what they had done with the city, and how simply they killed the survivors like real madmen. The professor listened attentively, and then said that he did not think that the first virus of T would look that way. The brain laughed and replied that he loves to communicate with smart people, and E noticed that the brain seems to be known to the brain of the evolution of the virus. He asked why the brain was looking for him, and he said that he wanted the guy to help him with his body. He asked if the guy had to see people who were helplessly sitting in wheelchairs. Then the brain added that his situation was much worse. He replied that he already understood this, and then asked what he could do in such a situation. The brain response very much surprised the young man, as he replied that the guy could resurrect his sister. Professor Nan opened his eyes wide, began to stutter. He answered the brain that he was joking at him. The guy's pupils narrowed very much. He looked without blinking at the test tube, and then said that this was impossible. The brain said that he was collecting information about the virus and noticed, if the guy wants to return his sister, then he would need this information. The guy picked up the flask and the brain asked if he was ready to listen to it with conditions. The young man stared at the flask and asked the brain, maybe he will listen to his thoughts. The brain replied, Is it not enough that he will help to save his sister? And then added that the guy should not be so greedy. He asked the brain whether he realized that he was looking for a government. He confirmed his guesses. The professor asked whether it was true that anyone who is connected with him would become an wanted goal. And this is extremely dangerous, and if he takes it, he would be in danger. The man put the flask with the brain back on the table and headed for the exit. For a while, the room became very quiet. But he was in no hurry to leave the laboratory. A few minutes later, the brain asked that the young man stop and asked what his conditions are. Nan said that first of all he wants to study it. In order to understand that in him so special, the guy thought that this brain was storing important information. The man said that secondly, he wants the brain to resurrect his sister as compensation since he endonates them. He also said that he wanted the brain to help him find a way to instill in the virus, while leaving them consciousness. The young man explained that he wants to turn infected into a real army. Professor Nan brought his face closer to the flask and said that he wanted to show the rest of the world their response. The brain looked at the man and came to the conclusion that he chose the right person, and he told the guy that he agreed with his conditions, but he would have to help him with his body. He said that he would help the brain, and he himself thought that if he would help him with the body, he would release this question to the world of a real demon, and it is better to delay this issue as much as possible. The guy took the flask in his hands, and the brain asked him to make him if he found out that he had betrayed him. Nan looked at him and noted that he most likely does not like imprisonment. The guy thought a little and told the brain that he would throw him into the sea if he had learned about betrayal, and then he added that he would leave him alone in the darkness of sea depths, and there he would definitely not wait for him. Professor Nan added that after a while, slow death was waiting for a slow death at the bottom of the sea. The brain carefully listened to the words to the young man and said that such punishment is much worse than ordinary death. The guy took the flask with the brain and went with her from the laboratory. He went to the corridor in which they continued to wait. The girl turned her head to the sound of the opening doors. She was frightened, but since she saw she immediately became a little easier. She went to Nanya, began to examine the flask with the brain, and then asked that it was in his hands. The brain said that people talk quieter, and then reported that something was wrong outside. The girl became near the guy, took out a gun and began to look around. The brain said that it feels a large number of drones that are equipped with missiles, and noticed that the doors of the laboratory would not survive this. He said that they need to go into the very depths of the laboratory, the only way they will be able to survive these blows. The brain continued to say that he feels a group of people, 6 men, and 1 woman entered the territory of the research institute. The man listened carefully to the brain and thought that it could be Chen and Wei, who told him the password. The guy went to the door and asked for the brain to open the door to them. He agreed to fulfill the request. Just a few minutes later, the doors are very easy and simply opened in front of them. At this time, a huge number of drones and helicopters flew over the building of the scientific institute. According to the radio, they said that the radar shows that everything was ready for execution, and the first round of bombing began. Another comrade replied that the message was accepted, and the first bomb flew into the institute building. A few minutes later, the bomb exploded, and there was a strong explosion. The fragments began to fly in different directions. The members of the rescue team stood near the doors. One of the guys entered the password. He cursed and said that the password was not true. The leader of the group was very angry. The man shouted very loudly at his subordinate, asked to act faster, as the drones were already approaching. And the guy replied that the password was too difficult. The system again reported that the password was not entered correctly, and the head of the team angrily hit the wall with his hand. To the great surprise of all, the doors present without any difficulties opened. Capital squeezed his hand into his fist, looked at his muscles. He mentally rejoiced and thought that he was a strong man. Young people began to enter the room very quickly because the drones posed a great danger. There was no time to think about something, and hesitating, one of the men who entered the room first shouted so that the others would move. One of the guys turned to the captain with the question of what to do with the doors since, like the first, were closed. The man looked at the door. He had no idea how to open it. He perfectly understood that they were doomed. They looked at the closed door and the team leader began to swear. The man looked at the closed door and heard how she began to make some sounds. Droplets of sweat performed on the head of the team. And he asked why everything happened, because at first everything went so well. The doors began to open, and he shouted so that people would go into the room faster. Chen and Wei, who carefully watched everything, came to the conclusion that Professor Nan did all this. She decided that he was definitely alive, and on the streets of the city it was restless. Drones and helicopters threw bombs on buildings. Zombies continued to walk the streets and look for victims for themselves. One of them heard the girl's voice. He heard a voice that came from a hole in the asphalt and held out his hand here. There was a girl who cried sobbing and called mom and dad. Zombie tried to get her hand. He couldn't get the girl, but a poisonous liquid began to drip from his wounds into the pit. She fell into the hands of a girl who hugged herself with her hands and cried silently. The girl raised her head and saw that her skin had changed. It surprised her very much. She began to cry with pain and resentment. And green, dense grasses began to germinate from her body. They began to grow at the speed of light, and after a while they smashed the concrete barrier, which was in their way. The girl continued to embrace herself with her hands. She did not even know that the zombie also became. She got up and began to follow the streets of the city, and a huge number of drones fly over her. The girl heard that a phrase that the target was discovered sounds from drones. She raised her head up and began to look at the drones that flew high in the sky. The girl was not at all afraid of them. She decided to destroy them with the help of grass that sprouted from her. Other drones tried to destroy it, threw bombs, but they fell next to the girl. After some time, when all the drones were destroyed, the girl, with the help of a blade of grass, rose high into the sky. At this time, experiments on the brain were conducted in the underground laboratory, which was in a huge flask. The brain asked Professor E that he would unhook the suction cups from him, since he feels bad because of them. The young man picked up a test tube, looked at her and said that headache is a normal indicator, and said that the brain took a deep breath. The guy looked at the test tube and told the brain that he said that the drones belonged to the government outside, and then he asked if they had built this building. The brain replied that he hacked their database, but did not find any information about this place. Nan thought that this place is most likely hidden even from the leading elite. He looked in front of him and understood that there was a lot of equipment for studying the brain, and the one who built this place is not a simple person. The professor went to the test tube and joyfully shouted that he succeeded. He said that it contains a combination of antibodies and virus, but without a toxic component for the brain, an accelerated way of evolution, and he called it the virus G, added that he opens the genes. The guy noted that he could resurrect his sister, and the brain noticed that it was worth printing genes, because the body could not withstand such a load and simply fly apart. He looked at the test tube and said that if the sister can be resurrected, then the effect of the virus can be neutralized. The brain told the guy that he had just discovered a strange zombie nearby, and noticed that he would be interested in E. A lot of drones flew over the city. There was a message that they were a search and rescue team. There was also a message that surviving citizens were asked to get out of the shelters so that they could save them. All this happened near the government building. The representative of the company of 4 stars tried to somehow calm the people who came to the rally. He said that they used 2,487 search and rescue aircraft, and 12 hours have passed after the start of the search. The rally was attended by journalists who shot the representative of the company 4 stars. The man began to cry and say that during the rescue operation it was not possible to find survivors. The young man cried bitterly. Some people cried with him, others looked in surprise. The company representative was silent for a while, closed his eyes and said that he was apologizing. One of the journalists jumped up to the man and asked him why the company continues to search for those who embroidered after the statement that they were not discovered. People began to ask if this was a waste of state resources. Others noted that citizens barely survive, and the company spends resources on another. Older people also believed that there was no need to spend resources on the city with monsters. The man put his hands on the rostrum and again asked for forgiveness. He noticed that he was thinking that someone had survived there. He said that he could assure them that rescue operations will stop and they will take up the reconstruction of the city and provide a detailed report. The youth said that the man was very kind. Others asked to support 4 stars and noticed that the company representative spent funds from good motives. The kid from the crowd began to climb onto the rostrum and shout that he would not allow him to refuse to search for survivors. The guy wanted to approach the representative, but the guard did not allow him to do this, and he shouted that his girlfriend was there, so they could not give up. The guard held the guy and told him that they tried with all their might. The funds were reserved for the reconstruction of the city and asked him to calm down. The man shouted that he wanted to return his girlfriend, and the people from the crowd shouted so that he stopped disgraced. The guy wanted to approach the representative of 4 stars, but the guard did not let him in. People before the parliament chanted, their families returned to them and did not stop the search. Some guys screamed so that everyone would fail, since there was no survivors left, and asked to stop arranging scenes. The young man really asked people to clean since the government is already too merciful to them. The woman who stood in the crowd fell a mobile phone from her hands, and she tried to raise it. After some time, she succeeded, and she looked at the phone with tears in her eyes and asked her daughter how it all happened. The representative of 4 stars was in his office. He stood by the window and looked in front of him. The assistant told him that after a public performance, the protests of families who survived practically stopped, and most of him supported the reconstruction of the city. This information greatly delighted the man. He turned his head and asked the assistant what was there with drones. He reported that the laboratory of the Research Institute has turned into ruins and stripping nearby territories continues. The man smiled and ordered to continue his work. He also noticed that there should not be a single survivor in the city, and then added that it was necessary to do databases first. He stood in front of the vessel in which the brain was and asked him if it seemed to him. He said that it was a little girl, the same age as his sister. The young man remembered his sister and said that there was really a chance, and the brain noted that his sister would return and they would look. The guy took out a gun and asked the brain where the girl was located, and he asked what the guy was up to. The professor said that he needed a girl in order to check his virus G for effectiveness. The brain said that he should not rush, as the drones are still flying. He said that such mutations themselves are a rather rare phenomenon. If it is killed, it is unclear when such an opportunity turns up. The man looked at the brain and said that he knew what he was worried about and said that he was not worth it, because he would return alive to help him with his body. The brain said that that girl is in the basement of a residential complex of a university town, but he wants to remind that with the current body, he will easily move his legs. He said that he would not go there just like that. He said that in his body there is antibodies to the virus T, and his body is stronger than that of an ordinary person. The young man takes out a syringe and began to gain a greenish liquid in it, which was in the test tube. The brain told the guy that he is crazy, because the process of infection is incredibly painful, and if he fails, his body will break and he will die. But Professor E released air from the syringe and noticed that such a chance falls out once in his life. The kid said that he could not allow the virus G just leak, so he would go. And the guy went to the exit from the laboratory. A few seconds later, the door slammed behind him. Professor E looked at the syringe with green contents and said that now, his future depends on this virus. And the man began to injure the virus to himself directly into the neck. At first, he injected a little. The virus began to diverge through his body. The guy thought that this was not enough and it was necessary to inject everything. The young man began to introduce the remains of the virus, and he immediately became very bad. The weakness was so strong that the syringe just fell out of the guy's hands. The girl at the other end of the building heard some kind of sound and asked what it was. The man automatically showed aside and said that the sound comes from the other side. He turned to his team and told them to be here, because there could be something dangerous there. The girl said that this excessive caution was not needed, because there may be Professor E. Capital wrinkled his forehead and thought about something. Members of the team began to call him. After a while, he gave the command to go forward, and the young people went forward. For safety reasons, they held their weapons in their hands. The doors opened and they saw a girl in black in the room. She did not expect to see more people here. A woman in uniform turned to see those who entered and saw the captain. She happily asked him how he got. The girl who was in the company of the captain asked her whether she knows where Professor E. The comrades stared at her and thought about who the Professor E is. She should be talking about that guy. The woman thought a little and then told a group of people to follow her. A few minutes later, they entered the laboratory in which there was a flask with the brain, and the woman asked him where the guy had gone. Capital picked up a weapon. He was very surprised and scared and very loudly asked what the hell was. The woman calmly told him, "The brain in the flask is not bad." He brought them here and opened the door to the laboratory. The man grimaced. Droplets of sweat appeared on his face, and he asked if he was really killed by mutants and zombies. The woman replied that Enan coped with them, and then added that one dog could kill a whole team of survivors, even a firearm to kill such a dog. The man asked in surprise how he managed to cope with them and specified he did not really call on the help of the god of war. The woman looked intently in the eye and said that the professor killed them with a knife. The man frowned again. Droplets of sweat appeared on his face, and he asked in disbelief if the girl was joking. The woman did not have time to answer the question, since someone began to knock on the door, and the captain asked who was there. The brain in the flask began to laugh, and then asked Professor Inanya whether the guy coped or not. The doors could not open, and the people who were in the laboratory heard a message that an energy jump happened and the laboratory system would be rebooted. The brain said that their new guests doubt the power of Inanya, and then added that he himself is interested in what this guy is capable of. The woman went to the flask, took up her with both hands, and screamed what was happening here. The brain looked at her and calmly said that the professor had introduced his virus. The girl corrected the shirt and asked with surprise if it was true that the professor introduced the T virus for himself. The brain replied that it was not the virus T, but the virus G. It is completely new and developed by a professor based on the T virus. The captain said that no matter what virus he is, an ordinary person will immediately turn into a zombie after infection, so they should shoot him. The man sent a weapon to the flask with the brain and already wanted to shoot, but the girl stopped him. The door began to open, and the captain screamed so that everyone was preparing because zombies entered the room. A few minutes later, hands appeared in the door connector, which tried to open it. The young man was able to open them with his hands and began slowly to go into the room. Professor Enan entered the laboratory and stopped near the entrance. The captain shouted very loudly that the laboratory was circulated and ordered to open fire. His subordinates immediately began to comply with the commander's order. They began to shoot at a man, but he calmly stood and watched everything that was happening. He was not at all afraid. The young man began to dodge the shots, and the captain looked at him in surprise. The guy began to calmly knock the weapons from the hands of boys. He just beat them in his hands. Professor Enan approached the captain and also knocked out firearms from his hands. A few minutes later, the men held hands. He went to the flask, and the captain said that all this was impossible. The brain told the professor that the indicators of his body really became much higher. The guy replied that the effect is much better than he could even imagine. As the virus developed and the physical form will be better, the brain asked what about his abilities, whether they awakened and asked him to show his strength. He said that because of the antibodies, the virus G cannot be so easy to penetrate its cells, and at present a small number of cells are modified, and then he added that it was necessary to wait a bit so that the virus multiplies both in other cells, and then the abilities will awaken. The girl asked the professor cultivated whether he was a gentle version of the virus T. He answered in the affirmative and added that he called his virus G. The lady looked at Ananya and asked him if he wanted to infect them. The man looked at the girl and said that they could not just sit here and wait for death. The guy told the girl that he came here in order to save people. He added that they simply opened fire on him and said that if he were a mentor of a girl, then the first lesson that he would teach her would be resistance. He told the girl that she would not repeat his mistakes and was not a dumb sheep, should try and die with dignity in case of failure. The girl told the professor that she could help them in the manufacture of injections. She said that she realized when she saw the drones that the country had abandoned them, so she would like to stand on his side. The girl said that the guy would not be worried, and she will take care of everything and tell others about his virus. Professor Enan stared into the girl's eyes, and she did not look away. The man put a hand on the girl on his shoulder and told her that she was much bolder than he thought. He approached other people and asked if they had any questions to him. The captain and members of his team frowned. Drops of sweat began to flow across their face. They looked inquiringly at E. The brain in the flask began to laugh and told people that they would not be stupid, because otherwise you will definitely die. The young man stared at people and said that they have only one option if they want to survive. He said that he needed a little time to finalize the virus and make an ordinary person to transfer it. Professor E also said that he should not once again tell them that he improves physical shape. Nan informed those present that he plans to unite with his help all survivors. People looked at Professor E wary, and Professor E said that he wanted to repulse N. The brain in the flask told those present that people ceased to cling to their own illusions of miraculous salvation. The captain went to the professor and asked him what percentage of survival from this virus. He replied that up to 80. The man said that this was enough, and with a smile, added that enough to put on the end of life. He squeezed his hand into his fist and said that when the injection is ready, he will be the first to experience it on himself. All other people who were in the laboratory also agreed to experience the vaccine. There were many volunteers to experience. People perfectly understood that there was no other way out of this situation. The guy took the brain in his hands and said that he would provide him with accurate coordinates. The brain said that it is still in the basement of the apartment 13 on the outskirts of the university town and does not run away anywhere. The woman went to Professor E and told him that she knew the device of that building well and would go with him. But the brand said Inanya that he should forget about it. Since another person, this is an additional burden. The woman stated that the roads are very difficult to arrange here, and E without her will get lost there, and she will be able to find the shortest way. She went to the professor and told him to believe her, because she would come in handy. The man was silent for a while, and then told the woman if he gets into trouble so that she saves her brain. The brain heard everything perfectly and said in surprise that the guy does not force them to save him. Professor Enan only thought for a few minutes and decided that he would take a woman with him. He held out his hand to her and said that she would give his weapon to him, so he would be much more reliable. They hit the road. Enan told the woman to move faster and try to keep up. After some time, they seemed near the ventilation. The guy said that all the exits were undermined and they were very lucky that they had survived. The guy said that they would go through her and opened her very quickly, then told the girl that he would go first. He climbed inside and called the woman to follow him. She agreed. Just a few minutes later, they were already in ventilation and moved forward. The guy told the woman not to lag behind because they should always hold on to each other. The girl turned to Mr. E with the question of what to do in the city. If he was destroyed, the G is strong, but he is powerless against weapons. The professor noted that this is only the initial version, and in the future, the infected people will be able to develop their abilities. The woman was surprised to clarify whether the professor wants to say that the new version of the virus would be even stronger. The guy noticed that the talent that they are looking for has abilities. The girl hit something in a ventilation pipe, then asked if everyone would have their own abilities after infection. The professor noted that after updating the formulas of people's ability to awaken, someone will be able to get 2 or even 3 abilities. Anand stopped moving forward. He was surprised to look at what was happening, because everything was in the fog. The girl began to cough very much. She became interested in how long they still be in this pipe. The man answered the question, and the woman began to call him by name again and again. A few minutes later, the brain said that he sees a snake in front of him, so people should beware. Enan replied that everything was fine, and in front of them is not a snake, but a plant that mutated and blocked the way out. The guy began to look at the plant and reported that this plant had predatory flowers. Professor Enan thought that in case of damage, flowers begin to contract. The man looked in front of him and thought that if he could grab the plant when he squeezes, then it would carry it forward. The guy turned his head to the girl and told her that she was very grabbing his legs. The woman looked scaredly at the young man. She was frightened, but agreed with him. Professor Enan took out a knife, which was always with him, and began to beat him with all his might on the plant. It was not as simple as it seemed at first glance, but the guy managed to stick a knife into the plant. It began to wave its roots from the side. The plant did not like that a knife was thrust into it. The young man grabbed the plant by one of the processes and shouted to the woman to be careful. Professor E held the brain with one hand, and the second held on the process of plants very much, and the girl with all her might held the guy by the legs. She was very scared. Literally a few seconds after the heads of young people, the light was visible, and after some time, the plant flew out of the ventilation window right into the street. They flew where they were scared and are not ready for the fact that events would develop just like that. The brain was confused in the processes of the plant. He yelled very much and called for help. Nanya. The guy landed on the ground. He was intact and sound, looked around. The brain was confused among the processes of the plant and frantically shouted that he would be helped rather. The guy took out his knife, lifted it high up and thought about how to quickly free the brain. The man began to very quickly wield cold weapons, and the processes of plants flew in different directions. When the plant was no longer a danger, Nan went to the aid of a woman, and she, in turn, took the flask with the brain and looked at him with surprise. Apparently did not like such adventures. Young people walked along the street. The woman looked around warily around, because drones flew over them. There were a lot of destroyed houses in the city. There were fires. The girl stopped, looked around and said that this is how hell looks on the ground. The parliament, as well as journalists, gathered in the hall of the National Assembly of China. The man approached the stand and said that the council adopted the resolution. 3 days later, the city of F would undergo a bloody bombardment. This is necessary in order to completely destroy the T-virus. The people who were in the hall began to clap their hands. They supported such a decision of the Security Council. The man in glasses looked at the man who was sitting near him and told him that this time everything would probably have been successful. He closed his eyes and thought that he would do anything to maintain his position. And the drones were monotonously bombing the city. He gradually turned into ruins. E and his companion looked at all this. A professor with notes of longing in his voice said that the whole city will look like that soon. They approached one of the houses which was also destroyed, and Enan said that the sample is in it. The man turned to the girl, looked at her, and then said that she would go with him. The woman walked ahead and asked the professor if they could hold out for 3 days. He replied that they could, because they needed to get out alive. At night, very strange things began to happen by the Xinjiang River. Zombies began to swim out of fashion. There were a huge number of them. The zombies stood up and began to go to the moonlight. In the sky there was just a full moon. They quietly, under cover of night, began to climb the bridge on the lower gateway. The monsters had a goal. System messages informed that pollution sources were discovered, but no one heard a message that it was necessary to start stripping and that the car is overloaded. In the city of D, on the banks of the river and the villa were people who had a fun time. The guy said that the authorities finally decided to blow up the city of F, and he was standing upstream from their city. He noticed that he could not sleep calmly. The guy said that he had heard about a guy named Nan, and he said that the virus spread around the world, and now he did not even go beyond the limits of one city. The man frowned. His pupils became like points, and he said that that guy is a liar. The youth sat at the tables, drank, had fun, they felt great. But suddenly the music stopped playing and the light turned off. It became very quiet. People were perplexed. The kid began to scream angrily. He was wondering what moron he turned off the light. He got up from his chair and noted that it could be a malfunction, and then added that he paid a lot of money for dinner in this place. He frowned his forehead and angrily said that he did not expect such an oblong and decided to check. The young man was walking in the dark, but the fact that he saw him shocked was a huge amount of zombies on the territory of the villa. Drops of sweat made out of fear on his face. He frantically yelled that in the territory of the zombie villa, the man began to run away from them. He frowned, and his pupils of his eyes became like dots, while the zombies saw the victim and fled after her. The young man fled with all his might. He tried to move away from the zombie, but he had no chance to escape. Other people also did not immediately realize that on the territory of the zombie villa. But when it became obvious, they decided to run away. The guys fled where the eyes looked. They perfectly understood that they needed to be saved, and zombies had a completely different goal. Professor Nan, along with his companion, went near the university in the city of Effie. The woman who went along with E was around the corner of the building. She quietly called him. Droplets of sweat appeared on her face from fright. The guy did not hear her, so she began to call for help very loudly because she had a zombie behind her. Professor Nan heard a scream and immediately came to the rescue. He very quickly got off the zombie. Then the man turned to the woman with a request that she was careful and did not shoot without the need. Young people stood near the house. They were alert and carefully examined the surroundings. They perfectly saw how drones fly in the sky. He told the girl that there was a hostel through the street, and to the west, the building that they are looking for. Nan looked in front of him and noted that there was a huge amount of zombies. Perhaps something happened there. The woman looked at the man in surprise and was surprised to ask if he saw something there. The professor's eyes burned with green fire. He said that he sees a crowd of zombies in front of him and asked if there was another route. She replied that they could try to get there through a campus, but it would take a lot of time. The guy said that the brain uses all his strength to make their path safer. If the duration of the path increases, then he does not have enough nutrient fluid. The woman offered to go right down the street if they stumble upon a zombie so that she would not worry about her. The man told the girl to remove the pistol from the fuse, because it is highly likely that she will need him soon. Zombies walked along the corridors of the building. They were actively looking for what they could profit from. In one gorge, a girl was hidden from which the grass began to grow, because there she felt safe. In the hands of the girl was a small box, which she carefully held in her hands. It was a radio. She heard the news that there were no survivors in the city and after 3 days it would be destroyed. The information that the girl heard did not appeal to her, and therefore she squeezed the radio with all her strength. She rose, began to go forward and said that they would regret such a decision. The girl walked along the corridor and screamed very much that she would kill them, be sure to destroy them. After a while, she calmed down and said that she felt power and flew out the window. Professor Nanya and his companions surrounded a huge amount of zombies. They stood back to the back and tried to defend. The professor was holding a knife in his hands. He was already ready to fight the zombie, but they were in no hurry to attack. Nan looked at the zombie. He was ready for battle, but also thought about how to avoid a clash with them. There were a lot of zombies. They rocked their teeth and pulled their nasty curses. Then he told the girl to try to break through, but she should not lose sight of him. The girl began to execute the professor's team, and zombies immediately began to attack her. The guy, as before, came to his companion to the rescue. He began to fight the zombie. More monsters began to approach them, but the guy actively dealt with them. They did not even have time to understand anything. Professor Nan turned to the girl and told her to move faster. Young people began to run away very quickly, but the zombies continued to escape after them. Therefore, the woman took out a gun, she began to aim, and droplets of sweat performed on her face. The girl very quickly dealt with the zombies, which followed on their heels. She told the guy that they had only 9 bullets left. It upset her very much. Professor E. Nan thought about the girl's words and told her that zombies were becoming stronger. Near the entrance to one of the buildings was a huge crowd of zombies. Most likely they tried to enter there. The man noted that the zombies there were crowded for a reason. Most likely there are survivors there. He closely watched everything that was happening and then invited the girl. Go and check it. They looked up and through the window saw that there were people in the building. They were very scared. In front of people, tears spoke in front of their eyes. They did not understand what was happening and how to get out of this trap. Just a few minutes later, the window was broken, and Professor E, along with their companion, were near people. Nan told people that he would take them to a safe place, but they should listen to him. He did not have time to finish yet, since the doors opened into the room and zombies ran there. The man had droplets of sweat on his face. The pupils became like points, and he screamed very loudly that it was a zombie. Professor E. Nan did not waste time in vain, but immediately began to fight the zombie and destroyed him. People looked at him warily. Their pupils narrowed out of fear, and droplets of sweat appeared on their face. And the zombie all longed for blood. They tried to knock the doors with the whole crowd to get inside as soon as possible. Under a strong pressure, the doors could not stand it and opened. A huge crowd of zombies rushed into the building. Inan told a woman to help people move to another room, because the zombies are already close. Just a few seconds, the doors opened, and the professor saw a lot of zombies. The zombies went ahead. They held out their hands, clasped their teeth, and longed for profit. The man stood opposite them and began to shoot them from the machine gun. He was assembled and absolutely calm. The woman who was sitting on the windowsill asked Mr. E to follow her faster. After a few seconds, the man was on a windowsill, and the woman helped the man get out on the roof. Before Professor E. Nan hid outside the window, a huge amount of zombies crawled out onto the windowsill. Young people heard some rustle behind him. This zombie got to them. They were very scared. The whole man was then covered in. He was very scared. He could not say anything, only wheezed. But the zombie could not touch him. Professor E. Nan grabbed him by the scruff of his scruff and held him very much. Everyone was surprised to watch everything that was happening. The guy did not let the zombie climb onto the roof. Professor E. Nan got out onto the roof of the building, and he took the monster and released down. The woman screamed to people so that they would not bag, but move faster because they need to get out. People went to the edge of the roof. There should have been a transition to another building, but it was not. The woman went to the edge of the roof, looked down, and saw a huge amount of zombies below. And a drone flew over them, and a systematic message was heard that the target was discovered. The girl raised her head up and said with irritation that the drone flies above them. A few minutes later, the drone hung right over people, and they continued to look at him. Professor E. Nan was the first to come to his senses and said that the drone still noticed them. The man went to the edge of the roof, looked down. There was a huge number of monsters. He was very surprised. On his face and his partner's were droplets of sweat. The man said that something was wrong here. He raised his head up and saw in the sky a very unusual monster. It was a girl from whom the blades were sprouted. Suddenly, she stopped and began to examine everything around her. She was very surprised. Professor Ignanis raised his head up with surprise, looked at her and thought that this was a very powerful mutation. The young man turned to the brain in the bank with the question whether this is a mutation that he spoke about earlier. He did not answer, and the professor again asked the question again. He behaved completely not usually. The guy decided to leave the brain alone and asked the girl if she understood him, and asked him to nod, if he understood. The guy looked at the zombie and thought about whether she had intelligence, because if they could not agree, then she would need to be repaired. As the girl spoke here, she said that in front of her a killer who has her hands in blood. Inan looked at the girl with surprise, and people who were also present on the roofs were very scared. The professor told the girl that there were not many people left in this world who can be helped, but the girl calmly looked at the young man and replied that she was talking about something else. Zombie pointed a finger at the professor's partner and noted that she was talking about her. The woman looked at a zombie girl in bewilderment. Her pupils narrowed, and droplets of sweat appeared on her face. And the zombie began to shout very loudly about the fact that the woman killed people. She called her a killer again and again. The woman was very frightened by the zombie because she perfectly understood that she was very angry with her. After a while, the woman became ill. Her head was dizzy. She closed her eyes and bit her lip. After a few seconds, Professor Inan was able to catch the grass with his hands, which the zombie wanted to destroy the woman. He looked at the zombie and told her that even if the woman is a killer, then it was not possible to immediately draw sudden conclusions about a person. The zombie hugged herself with her hands, and how the Chinese Blavant began to say that killing people badly A few minutes later, she screamed that the young man helped her and added that he was also a bad person. The zombie was very angry. She hid her blades of herbs here and there. They began to hide from her. Professor Enan thought that if this would continue, then they would all die. The man ran out of his shelter. He had some kind of plan. He decided that it could restrain her. Professor Enan applied his strength, which reached a zombie girl and began to run away. It helped. And the girl could not stand on her feet. She flew away a few meters. The guy turned to the woman in black and ordered her to leave. Professor Enan told her that she would take with her survivors and would not forget about the brain and case. The woman stood drooping. She began to look around. It was clear that she was very worried. The young man did not feel good. The blade of grass pierced his body through. A zombie girl picked up the professor high in the sky, and his partner screamed very loudly. The woman perfectly understood what was happening, but unfortunately, she could not help Inanya. After some time, the zombie let the guy let go. She threw him on the concrete roof with all her might. He lay on the roof and did not pose any danger to her, but the zombie continued to beat him with her strong blades. The girl looked at the man, but in her eyes there was no hatred and anger. Enan rose and told her that she was special and the virus took root in her body, but the girl did not answer. She continued to attack the guy. On the screen of the TV, which was in the office of the chairman of the 4 stars, was an image of a monster girl. The assistant reported to him that this photograph was taken by a drone in the city of F. The man was very scared. He frowned and said that this happened with the city in just a few days. The assistant said that they had lost contact with the villa in the city of D, and also asked if they had to start an investigation. The chairman said that the most important thing for them is to conduct a deal to buy bombs from the United States. He believes that he should not waste time for other goals. The assistant agreed with the words of the chairman, and he said with a smile that only with the help of rough power can this world be saved.